Well, good afternoon, I should say, everyone. We're just going to give this a few more minutes for more people to log in, but we'll get started here in another minute or so.
Are you practicing social distancing in your office?
Well, considering that nobody else is here, then yes, that will be the case. No,
I'm
actually,
practicing in a pseudo library.
is that the infamous Howard University library?
Yeah, this Moreland Springer Research Center at Howard University.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it has archival works.
All right, I'm just posting this on Facebook and Twitter so people can
I
see.
thought you were good.
Well, this is the live link, so that way people know.
Oh, you gonna tag me in it?
Do you have a hashtag?
Yeah, go ahead. Just put my name in there somewhere, right?
Well, I was gonna put in your name, but I didn't know like if you have a
No,
hashtag.
just link. If you link my name, then I can do the replication process.
Okay.
Oh,
Right.
is that a Pomona shirt, huh?
Mm-hmm. Oh well,
Yeah.
as the young people say, this is my Pomona swag.
With the Pomona banner in the background.
Mm-hmm. That is correct. It's
Go
all
ahead.
swag. Okay. Well, let's see. We have about 10 people here, so maybe we will go ahead and get started. So, thank you everyone for attending today. This is the next in our series for PRiME, Pomona Research and Mathematics Experience, where we have different speakers twice a week to talk about African Americans in the mathematical sciences. So today we have Talitha Washington. She is the Associate Professor of Mathematics at Howard University, as well as a Program Officer at the National Science Foundation. As a mathematician, she studies the applications of differential equations to problems in biology and engineering, as well as the development of non-standard finite difference schemes to numerically solve dynamical systems. She is a passionate educator and received the esteemed Outstanding Faculty Award just last year for her work at Howard. As a program officer at the National Science Foundation, she ensures that underrepresented groups and diverse institutions are included and uplifted in STEM work. And earlier this year, she received the NSF Director's Award for Superior Accomplishment for her commitment to STEM diversity. So, congratulations, Dr. Washington. Dr. Washington has worked on understanding and educating the mathematics community on the life and work of Dr. Albert Frank Cox. This work has been featured on both radio and television, as well as in the notices of the American Mathematical Society. But on top of her work with Dr. Cox, Howard, and the National Science Foundation, she is raising 3 STEM inclined teenagers. One of them, I believe, just graduated from high school. I believe that's correct. And she is keeping up a rigorous fitness lifestyle. She serves on numerous boards and is an in demand speaker on matters of mathematics and STEM diversity. She is a change maker and a friend, and we are quite delighted to have her here today. So, Dr. Washington, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. It's good to be here. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen. And get started on the presentation. So thank you for that lovely introduction, Ed Ray. It was very thorough. It's great. So my name is Talitha Washington. I'm a mathematician at Howard University, and I'm going to talk about Indiana, the genesis of Black PhD mathematicians. So my disclaimer, I have to give that before my presentation, that this material is based upon my work supported by the National Science Foundation's IP program. All of the opinions, remarks, comments, and all the rest of that are mine, and they do not reflect the reviews of any other organization. So all of these opinions are mine. I'm at fault. And I think Ed Ray had mentioned that you can put questions in the Q&A as I'm talking, because at the end, we'll just go through the questions one by one and have a quasi discussion. So I'm from Evansville, Indiana. That's me in the lower right. And I was adopted when I was about 8 months old. I went to an all-white Lutheran high school on the west side of Evansville, Indiana. And oftentimes growing up, I felt as the outlier, as Katherine Johnson did, as portrayed in the Hidden Figures movie. So I really, when I watched the Hidden Figures movie, it really resonated with my story and my trajectory. Also, there's a new movie about her that's on Prime Video, Amazon Prime, if you haven't seen it. Check it out. It's The Outlier, the story of Katherine Johnson. I've been at a number of places, did my postdoc at Duke University. I was faculty at the College of New Rochelle, which is right outside New York City. Also faculty at the University of Evansville, where I earned tenure. Then I turned around and earned tenure again at Howard University. And right now I'm doing a detail at the National Science Foundation in the Convergence Accelerator. My undergraduate I did at Spelman's College, which is a Black women's college in Atlanta, Georgia. So throughout my career, I've had the pleasure of meeting with a lot of mathematicians and just enjoying math. I enjoyed learning about the stories of those who came before me, so that when I look at things and life gets hard or research gets hard, I can think back to what they may have went through and how they persevered. And in turn, that gives me the strength and the courage to go forward. So first, I'm going to talk about Albertcox's father, Johnson Duncan Cox. So they called him JD. So JD Cox, he was a principal and teacher of Third Avenue Color School for over 40 years in Evansville, Indiana. So the school was built back in 1897, just a little while ago. And it closed in 1957 as a part of school integration. You know, and I know the students in Dr. Goins' program are really looking at the intersection of African-American mathematicians with history. So I'm going to intertwine historical comments throughout. So a lot of times people relish and take favor in the idea of integration, but we also remember that in the Black community, integration also meant the dismantling of a lot of our schools. A lot of our African-American teachers were laid off. A lot of Black-owned businesses suffered because integration really incurred a dismantling of the African-American economic system in America. Unfortunate. So, yeah, just a side comment. So JD Cox, he took courses at Evansville College, which later became the University of Evansville. So he took courses at Evansville College after he was a principal and after he was a teacher. And in Evansville, I remember, so in growing up, there was a lady called Linda Hudson who lived on my same street. And she says that she owes JD Cox because JD Cox was the one who hired her dad, who was Principal Wiley at a lot of the Evansville schools. And he was very infamous and did a lot of PhD work on education and race relations. So, and I actually have a copy of J.D. Cox's transcript from Evansville College. And you can see in the upper corner, there's a cursive that's written colored. It was commonplace in those times to actually write colored on transcripts. So when you go get a job, they knew what you were. So J.D. Cox was a deacon at Liberty Missionary Baptist Church, which was a church founded by former slaves. So Evansville, Indiana is a border town. It's right on the border of the Mason-Dixie line that kind of separated the North and the South. So former slaves organized Liberty Baptist Church back in 1865 in just a small brick building. But in 1866, a frame church, a new church was erected, torn down, and in 1880, they built a new one. So you can imagine this church, a group of people, they built a small church, and then it just grew. And currently in Evansville, it's the oldest African-American church there. And people came to Evansville, to the north, in hope of a better life, to maybe escape slavery or find jobs and things. So shown on the right-hand side with the arrow, that's J.D. Cox here. And this picture actually hangs on the wall at Liberty Baptist Church. So when I was digging up things, I just went to the church and tried to do some digging, and I'm walking, and there he was on the wall. And so J.D. was a really respected man in the community, had a high value of education, and I think he instilled those qualities in his children. On the left-hand side is his gravestone. That's at Oak Hill Cemetery in Evansville, which is a huge cemetery. And those are my 3 kids. They are much bigger now, right? The right one, she's 21. He's like 6'4" in the middle. So they're grown people now. But this was back in the day. And this is J.D. Cox's tombstone, which is located in Oak Hill Cemetery. So where is this? Well, okay, so here's the state of Here's the state of Indiana here. And in the lower western corner is Evansville. So like I said, it sits right there on the Ohio River. You can essentially look out to the Ohio River to Kentucky on the other side. So these stars here, let me back it up. This rose-colored diagram is what we call Baptist Town neighborhood. In those days, neighborhoods were segregated. Black folk, we lived in one area, and white folk lived in the other one. And there was a railroad track that ran up and down Highway 41, where if you go to the west of it, that's the black neighborhood, and east of it was the white neighborhood. So we had railroad tracks that actually segregated towns in the Midwest, and it was commonplace. And so this is just a depiction of Baptist Town. Now this star here, the blue with the yellow outline, that's where Albertcox grew up. This blue star here, that's where I grew up. And so we grew up in the same neighborhood, but I absolutely had no idea who he was and what he had done. Now you're probably wondering, why do I have Bruno Mars here on the lower left-hand corner? Well, there's always a story. So the gentleman here in the hat in the middle that has the arrow pointing down, that's Philip Lawrence. I grew up with him. He grew up like right over in this area. And when I was growing up, we didn't call our neighborhood Baptist Town. We actually called it Uptown. So you're either from Uptown or you're from Oakdale or you're from like the west side, the east side. But we were from the neighborhood called Uptown. He was one of the co-authors of the song Uptown Funk, which features a barbershop, which is where we would hang out in Uptown at Marcia Lynch's place. So in seeing that video, it really does resonate Evansville. And so Albertcox would have grown up in our neighborhood, and whoever would have known that this happens from Evansville, Indiana. Now, back in 1903, I'm going to hide the video panel. So back in 1903, Evansville had a race riot. What happened was there was a man, Lee Brown, he was a black man. He had a dispute with the bartender. Tom Berry, he was the bartender, Tom Berry. It was at a tavern over some debt that was owed. Now, there was an officer, heard the commotion, and followed Brown. Brown turned around, fatally shot Massey in the abdomen, and Massey just kept firing back. So when people learned that Massey died, white people formed a mob outside the jail, because at that point they had taken Lee Brown to the Evansville jail. This is the old Evansville jail, which is still there, not operational, but it's a historical landmark. So Lee Brown's in the jail. A white mob formed outside and was shouting, "Death to Negroes." Looting happened. White folks started looting hardware stores to get weapons, because literally the white folks were hunting down black people, because at that time it was, how dare a black man fire at a white police officer? So imagine 1903, Cox would have been 8 years old, living in Baptist Town. You have a race riot going on. The Indiana governor declared martial law in Evansville and sent a force of 300 state militia. 12 people died, more than 40 were wounded, and about 2,000 of Evansville's 8,000 black residents fled the city, because they literally had to flee for their lives. unfortunately, this is something that a historical reminder that's really resonant with what we're seeing today. So Albertcox went to undergrad at Indiana University, and he was part of the Euclidean Circle. I think that's a catchy name, honestly, right? Euclidean Geometry Circle. And so Albertcox, you can see him here in the picture. And so he went to Indiana University to study, and he studied mathematics and physics, and he enrolled in 1913. So in this Euclidean Circle, this is where people got together, they discussed mathematical questions and shared information. So this could be akin to just a seminar. And he was initiated into the circle on March 15th, 1915, and he was the first Black in the group. So note how they all wear suits. I love looking at pictures back in the days because all the students are just like wearing suits and just very formal. Albertcox became a member of the fraternity Kappa Alpha Psi in 1915, and I don't think that was by an accident. And I'll get to that in a moment. He was a secretary of the physics club in his senior year, and he was joined with his brother Avalon. So when he became a senior, his brother followed him to Indiana University, and they were at this institution at the same time. So Cox, he earned his bachelor's degree from Indiana University in 1917 with the major mathematics, and he had colored written across his transcript. He was denied membership in the Honor Society Phi Beta Kappa, and I think this was a, let's say, a point of contention that, yeah, that hopefully I could talk with them. Maybe something can be done. So I mentioned his brother joined him at Indiana University. So his brother graduated 2 years after him. He did in 1919. He was also a member of Kappa Alpha Psi. His brother taught in Bowling Green and also Princeton and became a science teacher at Crispus Attucks. So, and Crispus Attucks was the first and only all-Black high school in Indianapolis. Now, it's interesting that him and his brother both pursued science and math, and they both ended up in education. So I don't think this was by accident, and I think that their father had a really big role to play in that. So what was this link to the Kappas? So the founder, one of the founders of the Kappa Alpha Psi fraternity, George Wesley Edmonds, is from Evansville, Indiana. And I think they would have him and Albert would have overlapped in high school, and they certainly would have known each other because the community was very close-knit. So the founder, George Wesley Edmonds, he entered IU in 1919, founded the Kappa Alpha Psi fraternity, which is a huge fraternity, but he only stayed there for a year because his father was working in the coal mines. There's a lot of coal mines in that part of the country. His dad became ill and died, so George had to return home, and he worked in the coal mines on the railroad. And every Founders Day, the members of the Evansville Kappa Alpha Psi fraternity pay homage to the founder, George Wesley Edmonds. And these are the Evansville Kappas shown in the upper right. So Albertcox, actually, after he graduated, undergraduate, right, in 1970, right, so he graduated in 1970 from Indiana University, he became an instructor of mathematics at Alt Street School we call it across the bridge, across the river in Henderson, Kentucky. So on the lower left, you see Evansville, and then there's a road here, Highway 41, that connects to Henderson. So in the Indiana University Alumni Quarterly, it says that Albertcox was assistant principal of Douglas High School. So imagine, you just get out of college and you become an assistant principal. I think Albert was pretty ambitious. So ambitious that, I mean, how many students get a letter of recommendation from a president? And the president actually writes it, right? Some students, I don't know, none of my students, I hope, complain that they can't get letters of recommendations from faculty, let alone a president. So reading the letter on the left, it says, "Dear Sir," and this is from Albertcox, "I'm an alumnus of Indiana University, having graduated with the class of 1917. During the past year, I taught math and physics in the City High School of Henderson, Kentucky. but now I've been inducted into service and will leave next week for Camp Dodge in Des Moines, Iowa. For this reason, I wish to request of you a letter of recommendation as a student of IU. I am sure that it will mean much for me while trying to serve my country. If it will not inconvenience you, I would like to have your answer this week. So not only does he ask for a letter of recommendation, he says, give me the letter, President, this week. That's pretty impressive. And what happens? The president writes a letter back, right? There's no emails happening. We have Pony Express, right? So the president replies, to whom it may concern, Albert F. Cox, who is soon to enter the service of his country, graduated from Indiana University with a degree, Bachelor of Arts, June 13th, 1917. His major subject was mathematics. In addition to work in his major subject, he received credit for work in Romance languages, philosophy, physics, education, German, English, history, and best of all, hygiene. I wish my kids would get a class in hygiene. That's another story. So his record throughout was a very satisfactory one, the president. So it's amazing. So he was wanting to go into the Army, getting a letter of recommendation from the president of Indiana University so he could do that. I don't know. I think that's pretty impressive. As they say, go high or go home, right? Just go all the way. So Albert ended up serving in the U.S. Army in France during World War I in 1918 through 1919. And then upon returning, he became a professor at Shaw University. And Shaw University is a historically Black university in Raleigh, North Carolina. So he taught there from 1919 through 1922. And he was the head of Department of Natural Science. It's interesting that every place he lands, he ends up in some sort of leadership position. Now, in those times, they had this, what is called the American Baptist Yearbook, and they talked in this American Baptist Yearbook, really talked about the Baptist society across the nation. Now, interestingly enough, well, at least I found it interesting that under missionaries, special workers, etc., this is where they placed HBCUs. So I think that the American Baptist Publication Society saw historically Black colleges and universities not as institutions of the United States, but as missionary work. I think you get the implication. And so he's actually listed in this publication that appeared in 1919. Then he goes on, when he was at Shaw, they were like, you need to go get a PhD. So he started moonlighting at Cornell University, and he ended up earning his PhD from Cornell in 1925. His dissertation topic was polynomial solutions of difference equations. His thesis advisor was William Lloyd Garrison Williams, who was also the founder of the Canadian Mathematical Society. So his advisor was pretty high, prestigious, very well known. And his advisor realized that Cox had the chance to be recognized not only as the first Black in the United States to earn a PhD in math, but the first Black in the world to receive a PhD in math. So he urged Albert to send his thesis to a university in another country so that Cox's status in this regard would not be disputed. Universities in England and Germany turned it down. Some speculate that it's reasons of race, but Japan's Imperial University of Sendai accepted it. So once they accepted it, then it could be accepted here. He's also the first graduate of an Evansville, Indiana high school to receive a PhD. So, and in that time, there were not too many people earning doctorate degrees. So it was a pretty phenomenal feat that he did. So what did he look at? So his thesis, well, back in 1925, and I have a copy of it. It's a really interesting read. So I'm sure if for the PRiME research group, if Dr. Goins makes you type in LaTeX, just be thankful that you're not using a hardcore typewriter where you have to pound the keys, right? And then make all the mathematical notations in there. So it's, yeah, there's give and play. So here his thesis was entitled The Polynomial Solutions of the Difference Equations, A f of x plus 1 plus b f of x equals to phi of x. And so in this thesis, he talks about finding these polynomial solutions to this difference equation. And he also then, well, he was encouraged to publish it later, right? So you have a thesis, but you also want to make sure it gets in a peer-reviewed published journal. So note that there's like 9 years that transpired in between. So he publishes this in June of 1934. In reading the paper, you can see how his thought process kind of cleaned up how he was thinking through the mathematics. His dissertation, when you read it, at least when I read it, you can kind of see how he's thinking through. So, you know, with all the students doing summer research, once you keep all of your notes, and then when you look back at it in 5 years, you'll say, oh, yeah, you can see how you've grown. So Albert looked at difference equations. So consider a sequence, right? So a sequence is a function whose domain is a set of integers. So you're mapping integers to something else, maybe the real numbers. You can use two types of notation. You can use the function notation, f of 0, f of 1, f of 2, and so on. Or you can use the subscript notation, which is what we commonly see in, I guess, current day mathematics, x0, x1, x2, and so on. But in his thesis, he uses the function notation. So anytime you see an f of 1, you can think x of 1. A difference equation gives a relationship between values of a sequence and the differences among them. So you may say, well, what's the difference? But okay, I won't try to tell too many bad mathematical jokes. So he literally was looking at, can I come up with the difference equations such that if I plug it in to this boundary equation for f of x of 1 and f of x, it will solve it. The equation will balance out. So that's what he was looking to do. So again, you can almost read this as a times x of n plus 1 plus b times x of n is equal to this phi of x. And we can think of this phi of x being a polynomial. And as such, we would expect polynomial solutions. Okay, so that's kind of the gist of what he was looking at in his thesis. Now, what else happened in 1925 in Indiana? Well, the Klan was happening in Indiana in 1925. There was a gentleman by the name of David Curtis Stevenson. He was born in Houston, Texas, and in 1920, he came to Evansville, Indiana. And right in the outskirts of town, he would have these huge Klan rallies where he would induct people and bring them into the Klan. It was this huge movement to make America great again, instill Americanism into her people. And in 1922, 2 years after Cummings, he's very influential. He was Indiana's leading Klansman and led the Indiana Klan to be the strongest organization in America. I remember watching, if you haven't seen it, the History Channel has a documentary on the Ku Klux Klan. And they said at one time, Indiana, the state of Indiana, had more registered Klansmen than all of the southern states combined, which can give you the magnitude of the Klan's activity in Indiana. So in 1924, the Indiana Klan had about 250,000 members. And these members including politicians, the governor at Jackson, mayors, all different layers of people in the community. So in 1925, what happened? Stevenson was arrested and charged with murder. Why? There was a lady, Marge Oberholzer. She was a state house secretary, and he essentially kidnapped her, put her on a private car train, and they were going to Hammond, Indiana, which is northwest Indiana. Stevenson raped and sexually mutilated her. On her deathbed, she was able to get away. On her deathbed, she signed an affidavit as to what happened. And, you know, drinking, the acts that he did against her, this went against all of the ideals of the Klan. And so they took him to court, and his famous quote really is, "I am the law in Indiana," because he literally had everybody in his back pocket. So in 1925, that's when the case came out that Stevenson was found guilty for raping and kidnapping Marge Oberholzer. And so, but while he was in the Indiana State Prison, he leaked documents because he figured if I'm going down, I'm going to take them all down. So he ended the careers of the governor at Jackson, Indianapolis Mayor John Duval, and several other politicians. So it was 1925, Stevenson went down for the Klan in Indiana. Also in 1925, Albertcox became the first Black to earn a PhD in math. both from Evansville. So you can see these, I don't know what you call it, opposite polarities happening in the same year. So Albert Frank Cox, after earning his PhD, he went to West Virginia State College. So in those days, if you were Black, you could get a job at a historically Black college or university. And there are about 101, 103 of those today, depending on how you count. And that's the only where you could get a job if you were Black. He became the head of the math and physics departments from 1925 through 1929. So he kept going back to Evansville, Indiana, and to visit family. His family had moved to Princeton, Indiana. And if you ever happen to come to Washington, D.C., to the African American Smithsonian Museum, Princeton, Indiana is featured there for the Lyle Station, which was an African American settlement in Princeton, Indiana. Right? So he came back home. He married Belula Kaufman, who's from Princeton, and at West Virginia State. So imagine, right? He wanted to get his life together. He got the PhD, has the job. I guess maybe he was thinking, I'm ready to get married. So I think he was very methodical in how and what he did in life. And he did it well. So at West Virginia State College, the president there was John Davis. Now, John Davis was pretty hardcore. He went out and he sought to make West Virginia State College the #1. So West Virginia State College is a historically Black college in West Virginia. And John Davis is a graduate of Morehouse College. He led the institution to be the first public college, first ever, in West Virginia to be accredited in 1927. So that's first out of all white Black colleges, the first one. So he's very ambitious. So if you know Carter G. Woodson is basically the founder of Black History Week, which then expanded to Black History Month. He recruited Carter G. Woodson to come there to be an academic dean. So he went out and just found people and just pulled them in. So he missed Albert Cox missed Katherine Johnson, who came, but she was attending high school on the campus of West Virginia State University when she was just 10 years old in 1928. So it could have happened that they crossed paths. So they were in the same area at the same time. So just digging up random facts. So West Virginia State College used to be called West Virginia Collegiate Institute. So in 1928, always interesting, what did people make at that time? So John Davis, right, this is public record. It's a public institution, so you can look up the salaries. He was making $4,500. Now, West Virginia University, that at the time, that was the white institution, their president was making $9,000. So when people talk about historical underfunding of HBCUs, yeah, that would be a nice quantitative project. Anyway, so I digress sometimes. Notice at the bottom, we also have Percy Julian, who is a very popular chemist who came to Howard as well. So Albert Cox, he was there on a 12-month, and he made over the year $2,229.17. Okay. So in 1929, Albert comes to the Mecca. So Howard University is in Washington, D.C. People refer to Howard as the Mecca or the Black Mecca because in those days, it was the ambition of every Black scholar to come to Howard University. So in 1957, he became the chair, and the mathematics department at Howard established the Albertcox Scholarship in 1975, and that's given out every spring to math majors. So Howard has produced the highest number of African-American doctorates in mathematics by far, probably mostly due to Neil Hyman, who's a powerhouse. And so there were 8 Black PhDs in mathematics employed at Howard University. Albert Cox, Woodard was there, Claytor, Blackwell, and I know in this series you've heard of these other mathematicians, but there were other Black PhD mathematicians that came to Howard who were there and have that, what somebody calls, they gained the Howard magic, so to speak. So David Blackwell said it was the ambition of every Black scholar in those days to get a job at Howard. And one interesting thing about David Blackwell, if you go to Evansville, I-64 runs east-west. If you go west on I-64 towards St. Louis, you'll pass through Centralia, Illinois, which is where David Blackwell was from. And so that's about maybe an hour and a half drive west of Evansville. So they're from the same area or the same neck of the woods of the country, which is interesting. Howard had the first PhD math program at a historically Black college university in 1976. And of course, you know, Black Panther, right? So after Albert was at Howard, he was thinking about systems of grading. Oftentimes, faculty, we have our own opinions on how to do grading skills and how they should be done. So Albert kind of asked the question, is there a way to develop a system of grading so that if one person has one way to grade, another person has another way to grade, we can compare the two and make sense of them? So he looked at these grading systems, and he used interpolating functions to develop this system of grading, which actually became popular and well used in the College of Arts and Sciences at Howard. Now, what was this system? So we have think about the percentage system where you have 90% to 100 is an A, and then you have 80 to 89% is a B. So we have these little jumps, right? So if you were to graph 90 to 100, there's a dash, 80 to 89, there's a dash, that would be B, and then you have C and so on. So you have these jumps that are happening. It's not a continuous function. There's jumps because you have A, B, C, D, right? Partitioned by the subintervals. And so he looked at this up-step percentage, where as the percentages increase, the grade increases, and then similarly for the down-step. So the goal is that each system admits a step function. Can you find a continuous interpolating function and then convert one system to another? So just to give the idea of what this looks like, the graph on the right-hand side, on the horizontal axis, you can think of that as your percentage. On this axis, that you can think of that as either A, B, or C, or points, -4, -3, -2, 1, 0, 1, 2, 3, right? Steps going up. So what we can do is we can take a finite distribution function with these, everybody loves a good Heaviside function, and those actually represent the dashes here, right? So you sum up all of these H sub mu's, and we can get this distribution function f of x. So once we have that grading system, you can think 90 to 100, it would be maybe like a 3, right? 80 to 89, that would be a 2 on that vertical axis, and so on. What we can do is we can pass a curve through those dashes, in this case a hyperbola, to kind of smooth it out, because obviously these dashes, if you look at all these dashes together, it's discontinuous. But we can approximate it with a hyperbola. So on the top, we have one grading system, and then on the bottom, we have another grading system. So the top one, you have the grading system, -2, -1, 0, 1, 2, 3. We cheat on the 4 because we want the 4 to do the interpolating hyperbola. And then we have another grading system, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then again, we cheat on the 5. We just need that to kind of connect the curve and have it pass through the points. So for any grade, let's say if person 1 uses grading system S1, person 2 uses grading system S2. Let's say if I got let's hope, right? I don't know. If I got a 90%, so that's the 9 here on this horizontal axis, I can then see what it would look like through person 1, and then what that maps to for person 2, right? So now I can have a way that I can go between person's 1 grading system and person's 2 grading system. And so he essentially just kind of, through this paper, he brought together his love of just kind of math, thinking through things mathematically with, you know, what does it really mean to do a grading system? And how do you then extrapolate going from one grading system to another? How do you relate the two? So in 1953, Albert appears in the Pi Mu Epsilon journal, and I'm a member of Pi Mu Epsilon. It's an honorary mathematical fraternity. And so this is the Alpha District of Columbia. So here he presented on the nature of mathematical science. I do love that title. So you can see that, you know, even with the high teaching load at Howard, they had a high teaching load in those days, he still published, and he was still active in giving presentations. I forgot to say that when he was a graduate student, right after he got his PhD, he became a member of the American Mathematical Society. So he was also a member of AMS. So he was active in the mathematical community. So in 1969, Albert passed away. On the left is the image of Science magazine. Well, back in 1969. And in Science magazine is the snippet where they say Albert F. Cox, age 73, former chairman of mathematics department, Howard University. He passed away on November 28. And I think that Science magazine would publish people who had passed on who were really of high caliber, and Albert was included. So 1969, Albert passes away. What would he have seen in those, at least in the 60s, right? So we saw what he saw back in the race riots in Evansville in 1903 when he was 8, and then in 1925 when he gets his PhD. And now in the 1960s, right before he passes away, what was happening? Well, if you look on the lower left, that's Tougaloo College. So in 1963, so the gentleman here, he's a social science professor. Him and his 2 students were sitting at the segregated lunch counter in Woolworth store, and it escalated quite rapidly because at those times there was segregation and they were not allowed to serve Black folk. In the right-hand side in the middle, those are the 4 freshmen from North Carolina A&T, who's the largest producer of Black engineers in the country. So the 4 freshmen, just imagine, you're in your first year of college. They sat down at the lunch counter, and they essentially are credited for starting the sit-ins that then happened across the nation. So in 1963, in the upper right, we have the March on Washington, where Martin Luther King gives his speech on his I Have a Dream speech. And during the eulogy for George Floyd, Reverend L. Sharpton announced that on August 28th, this August 28th, that's coming up, 2020, marks the 57th anniversary of the March on Washington. And Reverend L. Sharpton said that we're going back to Washington to restore and recommit that dream of Martin Luther King. He said we need to go back to Washington, stand up, Black, white, Latino, Arab, in the shadows of Lincoln and tell them, this is the time to stop this. We are going to change the time. So imagine from 1963 to today, the struggle continues. In the middle upper, that's the 1965 March over Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. And then in the lower right, I think that's one of my favorite pictures, Martin Luther King, who was assassinated in 1968, and Malcolm X preceded him. Malcolm X was assassinated on 1965. So we see all of the perils our society has had and may still have. In 1969, 17 mathematicians gathered in New Orleans. Some say they gathered earlier in Pascal's restaurant in Atlanta. But nonetheless, they said that we need to create a space in mathematics where we promote excellence and we promote the mathematical development of underrepresented American minorities, in this case, with a focus on African-American mathematicians. Before this time, there would be math conferences, and oftentimes, if you were Black, you couldn't stay in the same hotel because a lot of the conferences were held in places that held segregation. And so there was friction, I'll be nice. There was friction in the mathematical community on issues around race. So these founders of NAM got together and say, if not we as spokespersons, then who? If not now to begin change, then when? So these questions really resonate. And I charge the young folk to adopt these questions and just ask yourself, if you don't speak up, then who's going to do it? If we don't begin the change, then when are we going to do it? So in the fall of 2006, 2007, I was featured in the Spelman Messenger. I'm a graduate of Spelman College, 1996, a couple years ago, maybe a couple decades. So in this, they said that I wrote an article on April 18th, 2006, in my hometown paper, Evansville Courier Press, about the man, Albertcox, who inspired her to earn her PhD in mathematics. The story highlights the life of Evansville native Albertcox, the first African-American to receive a PhD in mathematics in 1925. Dr. Washington tells how she became the second African-American from Evansville to earn her PhD in mathematics in 2001, and thanks Cox for paving the way. And so this really was a tribute to my work in putting together a plaque in collaboration. I had community partners. No good deed is done by one. It's always done by many. So I rallied and I was able to bring together the Evansville Vanderbilt School Corporation, the University of Evansville, the University of Southern Indiana, and also Ivy Tech Community College to come together and donate this plaque. So the plaque reads, and it's at the 600 block of Cherry Street, right under a tulip tree. So it reads, home of Johnson Duncan Cox. J.D. Cox was a teacher and principal at 3rd Avenue School for 40 years. In 1925, his son, Albert Frank Cox, became the first graduate of an Evansville high school to receive a PhD and the first African-American to earn a PhD in mathematics. So I had the honor and the privilege of just bringing everybody together to pay homage. And in all honesty, I didn't really know about Albert or JD until I became an adult and grown up. I was moving away. I was at the College of New Rochelle at the time. I had no idea. What happened was I stumbled across Scott Williams's webpage, Dr. Scott Williams's webpage, Mathematicians of the African Diaspora. And I was just reading through, and then I come across Albertcox, and I said, wait a minute, he's the first. Wait a minute, he's from Evansville. And then the story goes from there. Had no idea. So it's important that we tell these stories so people really know who came before us, what they went through. So when life gets hard, we get some encouragement to make it through. So in the dedication ceremony for the plaque, the Cox family came down. So going from the leftmost, so here we have 4 generations. On the left, we have Deacon J.D. Cox, who's the principal. And then here we have Albert Frank Cox. And then his son is on the lower right here. This is Albert Lucian Cox. And so Albert Lucian Cox, which is Albert Frank Cox's son, hang with me, he graduated magna cum laude from Howard University with a degree in mathematics, go figure, and earned his master's and doctorate degrees in engineering from George Washington University. Dr. Cox, Albert Lucian Cox, retired from Howard University after serving 26 years as professor, associate dean of the School of Engineering, and then senior associate vice president for academic affairs. So and then sitting next to him is his wife, Sandra, who have been married, well, over 48 years now. So his son then became what they call a Howard baby and actually rose to become in a position of leadership at Howard University. And so Albert Lucian Cox's son, he's in the far left here. This is Albert Lucian Cox Jr. So this would be the 4th generation. He's a program manager in the Applied Science program at the NASA headquarters here in Washington, D.C. So he earned his bachelor's in mathematics and physics. Again, here we have more math from Morehouse College, and earned his master's degree in electrical engineering from Howard University. He lives around here in Maryland. I had the pleasure of attending his, I think it was his 60th birthday celebration. It was fun. It was in a tavern. It's good times. And then this is Stephanie Cox Nash. She's a licensed psychiatric social worker and a member of the family therapy practice here in DC. She earned her undergraduate degree in psychology from Rutgers and a master's degree in social work from Howard University. And then Michael Cox is in the middle here. He graduated from Howard University with a degree in zoology, and his professional career encompasses corporate business development, and he's a regular speaker, and he also lives in the DC area. So it's great to see how you have this passion for education just spill over to the rest of the Cox family. And I've been trying to convince, I'll put it out on video, Albert Lucian Cox Jr. to bring out some of Albert Frank Cox's materials. He has Albert Frank Cox's writing table that he wrote on, which I think would be an amazing artifact. And I think there are other artifacts of Albert Frank Cox that could be preserved. At Howard University, we have a student-run magazine, or newspaper rather, it's called the Hilltop because at Howard, whenever you come and visit, once we get through all of this hot mess, to get to Howard, you have to go up what we call the Howard Hill. And you can always tell the first timers because by the time they get to the top, they're out of breath. So on the left-hand side, this is a picture of Albert Lucian Cox with his dad, Albert Frank Cox. And here's just a snippet of the newspaper. It says his son, Albert Lucian Cox, Associate Dean of Howard University School of Engineering, said his father's advice was, be aware of obstacles, but don't let them stand in your way. Rather, use your talents and have faith and believe in yourself that you can achieve. So Albert Cox is accredited with producing the grading formula that I had talked about that completely changed the system of grading within Howard's College of Liberal Arts in 1947. Cox is also praised for directing students who worked under him for the master's degree program in mathematics. I haven't been able to find that list yet, but working on it. In 1965, more of his students have received master's degree than any other professor at Howard. Dean Cox said, I am proud of my father. I hold him up in great esteem. He added, the obstacles he had to overcome because of so many closed doors and his ability to achieve and open doors for others makes me extremely happy. Dean Cox goes on to say, it is my hope that students see him as a role model. Don't think about the fact that your students, you're often held back because of the color of your skin. But like my father did, have faith and a willingness, desire to achieve. Then obstacles will be broken and you too will help make a difference for others. With that, and this fall, October 3rd, the Indiana section of the MAA is going to have a special back home again in Indiana, and I'm going to be talking about the mathematics of Cox, so getting into more details. So if you want a part 2, come check out the Indiana section of the MAA meeting, October 3rd. So with that, we'll take any questions.
Okay, well, first, thank you very much, Dr. Washington. That was a wonderful discussion of Dr. Cox and also all of the mathematics, and the influence that he had coming from the state of Indiana. While we're waiting maybe for more questions to come in here to the Q&A, I do actually have a couple of questions I'd like to ask you. I want to take more of a deep dive in some of this. I'm curious about what the state of affairs was in Indiana in the early 1900s. And maybe I could kind of phrase it as follows. You mentioned that there was a race riot in Evansville in 1903. And eventually, Albert Frank Cox decided to go to Indiana University, not too far away from Evansville, early 19-teens. There also was a lot of activity in Indianapolis at the time. For example, Madam C.J. Walker had established herself there in Indianapolis in about 1910 or so, and was on her way to becoming the richest woman that America would ever see, the first self-made millionaire. I'm just wondering, growing up there in Evansville, did you have an idea of what it meant to be Black in the early 1900s? Was there a sense of things weren't great because of the race riot, or was there a sense of like progress was being made because of Madam C.J. Walker?
Well, Madam C.J. Walker was Indianapolis, so that's a different, even though it's in the same state, that would be a little bit farther out. So Indianapolis, they did build that new highway to connect it, but Evansville is pretty much kind of isolated, maybe a population of 150,000, 200,000 people. But with the history, in growing up, nobody talked about the history of the Klan in Evansville. So there are certain things you just don't talk about. I remember back when I was at the University of Evansville, I forget what year that was, I ran for school board, countywide election. And we had to then go knock on doors in all parts of the county, right? It's nonpartisan. And I had friends, African-American, who were like, no, I'm not going to that part of town. And this was like present day. So even to present day, the racial thickness that has happened, that has plagued Evansville is still there. Some people talk about it. Honestly, I don't think we've had the honest conversation to talk about it enough. I'm hoping that moving forward, those conversations can happen and progress can be made. But definitely, when I was growing up, if you went to the wrong side of town, you'd definitely be called the N-word, hands down. I remember my older brother, he's a couple years older than me. He was on the basketball team, and they were traveling on a bus to the other town, right? Not too far outside of Evansville. And on the way to the school, there's a cross burning on the side of the road. So imagine being a high schooler, right? This is, I don't think I'm that old. And you're going to play a game and there's a cross burning, right? And so these realities were the realities that I grew up with. And I think these realities are still there. I'm not sure if we have the candid enough conversations about it, because I think that if we don't deal with some of these tough issues and tough conversations, they could get in the way of progress. And some people ask me, what was it about Evansville? You have mathematician, yeah, and there's a lot of other people that went on to do some really great, awesome things. What was it? Well, I will say in Evansville, the African-American community is very tight. So when I was growing up, for better or for worse, if I went and did something I wasn't supposed to, before I walked in the house, somebody had called my mother, and I was like, oh, come on, right? And everybody has the right to give you a lecture on anything. When I go back, I still see people that were my second and third. I have a bunch of moms and a bunch of dads and aunts and uncles. And so it's a very familial town where you can sit down with people and you feel like people are family. Nobody really is a stranger. And so the community is very welcoming. So I think that attributes to a lot of people just saying, okay, I know who I am. I know where I'm coming from. And we tend to just go off and do some things.
Right. Well, then let me follow up with that. My understanding is that there is an African-American museum there in Evansville.
Yes.
And I know that Evansville is considered to be the second largest, or to have the second largest Black population in the state of Indiana outside of Gary, Indiana. What type of influence do you think Albertcox has on the city? Do a lot of people know who Cox is? Are they familiar with his family? Is there some influence there? What do people think about them being the birthplace of the first Black mathematician?
So when I did it, and actually when I was looking through my notes, when I did the plaque, one of my colleagues said, "You make us proud." Nobody talked about the Cox family. And so when Cox, after he graduated like Indiana University and went on, he was going home to Princeton. So his parents had moved to Princeton. He wasn't coming back to Evansville. So people knew of him, but they just didn't.
How far is Princeton from Evansville?
Oh gosh, 45 minutes drive straight up 41, maybe 30 minutes. So in Princeton, you have the Toyota manufacturing plant, which is super huge, right? If you buy a Toyota in the Midwest, it comes from there, sort of thing. But Princeton has a very vibrant, right, Black community there. And like I said, it's featured in the African American Smithsonian. So I'm not sure if it's because he didn't come back to Evansville and continue these connections or what it was, but Dr. Wiley, like I said, was hired by J.D. Cox, and Dr. Wiley was another upstanding citizen. He was a principal. He was very popular, in the community. So people, I think the elders, so if you talk to the elders, they knew of him, but for some reason that story didn't pass down to the younger folks. And since you bring up the Evansville African American Museum, I just have to I'm just going to give a shameless plug, if that's okay. May I? So the Evansville African American Museum, if you ever come to Evansville, I would encourage you to go to this museum. They have a plaque for Albertcox on the wall that talks about his work. And they also talk about other Evansville African Americans who went off and done great things. Remember Ron Glass? He played in Taxi. He was an actor in Taxi. He's from Evansville. Yeah, and so there are other famous people who are from Evansville, and they're featured in the museum. And of course, the museum director is a Howard University graduate, and she's phenomenal. So I would definitely check out the museum. It's a really good gem there.
Well, we have a few more minutes. I wanted to, since you mentioned Howard University, I do want to spend a little bit of time to ask you about Albertcox's time at Howard. And I wanted to ask you this question and trying to put everything together. Albertcox started at Howard 1929, 1930. And right about that time, there were a lot of people that were starting to come to the mathematics department. For example, we recently heard about David Blackwell, who came to Howard in 1944. My understanding is that David Blackwell eventually became full professor the same year that Albertcox did in 1947. But Blackwell was named department chair before Cox was. Cox was named chair 1947, and Blackwell was named chair 1947. Cox wasn't named chair until Blackwell left 1954. Do you think that maybe there was any kind of competition between them? Was there any kind of animosity between them, being among the first two blacks to get a PhD, but one was kind of ranked over the other, even though one was younger than the other?
So I don't think it was between Cox and Woodard. And I don't think, I mean, Blackwell and Cox. I don't think it was between Blackwell. So remember at the time, they were trying to get, Cox didn't really have, he had a publication on his dissertation. But remember that other publication when I talked about the series of grading, that's what got him the full.
I see.
Right. So when he published that paper, then he could be promoted. So I think he just had to get the publication situated so that he could advance in the career. So when he came to Howard, the person who was the second African-American to earn a PhD in math, Woodard, right? That's why I said his name, was there. And so Woodard had been the dean and had been at Howard, that's Dudley Weldon Woodard, been at Howard for a while. And so here comes Cox with the PhD. And, you know, in mathematics, we have, I don't know, maybe they call it friendly competition. I'm not sure if this was so friendly. But then Woodard went in and got a PhD and came back. It was like, I don't think Woodard wanted to be, how do you say it, outdone sort of thing. Right. Yeah. So I think there may have been tension between Woodard and Cox, but I don't think, probably not with Blackwell. I think really for that timing with Blackwell, Cox just had to get a publication out so he could advance.
I see. That makes sense. Right. Yeah. Well, I want to ask a question that is here in the chat window. This is from Sankar Siddhamaran, and it asks, who were Dr. Cox's early or notable PhD students?
Sankar Siddhamaran is my fantastic colleague, math colleague at Howard University. So maybe I could elicit you to help me. I've been asking around where are the list of students, how can we find this? And I haven't come up with anything yet. So I want to actually figure out how can we get a list. I did ask Neil Hyman, because Neil Hyman just tends to have like an encyclopedia in his head about everything. And he said that maybe the graduate school would know, but I'm not sure. I don't have the information. But Neil Hyman said that he wasn't sure they did a mapping, that if you have people who got the master's degree, a mapping to the individual who mentored them. So this is, I guess, a lesson to all of us, that sometimes we don't keep records that we think would be important to other people. We just do our work and we just keep on doing without saying, maybe somebody down the road would actually be interested in learning about what and how I did something. Right. So, but maybe Sankar, you could help me out.
Okay. Well, that will
be a fun project.
Right. Well, let's maybe end with one last question. And this is more of a question for you personally. This comes from Jayla Langford, who asks, what was your biggest challenge that you endured while getting your education?
Let's see. Which level?
Yeah, it doesn't specify here, so probably however you want to answer it.
However you want to answer it. I think, I don't know. I think for me, I'm pretty hard-headed, which is, you know, it's good and bad. I think being hard-headed and kind of having your mind made up can help safeguard against what they call now microaggressions and macroaggressions that get thrown, in this case at me, as an African-American female. And I mean, I've had challenges probably along every step of the way. And I think, as they say, the higher up in education, the higher the stakes up are in the challenge, right? It's just like, okay, I got through that one. So I think one of my earliest remembered challenges was back, I think it was second grade. I went to sleepover and my fellow classmate says, my mother said I cannot play with you. So I thought that, is there something wrong with me? Am I an alien? What is this? And I think I carried that kind of like, what is wrong with me? But it wasn't me. It was because they saw me as Black, and that was a problem. They didn't want their child interacting with another Black student. So going through K through 8, I went to like an all-white K through 8 school, and it was a challenge because I was the lone Negro, and kind of that sentiment from 2nd grade propagated throughout. So by 7th grade, I remember I asked my parents to take me out, and they was like, "Oh, you only have one more year." And I think at that point, that's when I snapped, because I used to be very quiet, shy, calm, behind the scenes. But in 7th grade, I was like, okay, well, either I'm going to have to beat them academically, or I'm just going to be crushed emotionally and spiritually. So in 7th grade, I just made the choice to survive, be hard-headed, just kind of go for it, and just kind of knock everybody out academically. So I became very competitive academically. And so I think, for better or for worse, that's up for debate, I think that kind of helped spawn me, it prepared me later on to meet academic challenges, because when I met academic challenges, I was like, well, if I can get through that, I can knock this out too. By the time I was going, so when I entered high school, I entered into the integrated high school in Evansville, Bossy High School, proud alum, I'm a bulldog. And I was like, oh, finally, I'm in a school, diverse students. I remember my 9th grade year, me and my girlfriend at the time, Kenya Summers, we made up a plan. We said, we want to do all this stuff for Black History Month. We want a multicultural class, because we didn't have anything on the education of Black people. Nothing in our history classes, no activities, no nothing. So we came up with a long list, made an appointment with the principal, sat down with the principal and said, hey, we have this list and we want to get this done. And he said, oh, race relations are fine. We don't need to do anything. So I remember, this is me, 9th grade, right? I went in the hallway, I said, he's not going to do that to us. Yeah, I was very ambitious at a young age. And yeah, I looked for educational opportunities. So that evening, I picked up the phone book. They had paper phone books at the time. I looked up the superintendent, shop stall at the time. So I called him up. I told him what happened. And I remember his words. He said, no one can stop you from your education. That's exact. And so those words just stuck with me over time. And so by the time I was a senior, Mrs. Fields, who was a teacher at Bossy High School many years, Mrs. Fields, she taught the African-American history class. We took a trip to Atlanta my junior year, which is why I ended up going to Spelman later. We had a human relations club. We celebrated Martin Luther King. But none of that would have happened if I didn't just put my foot down in 9th grade. And so that spirit, that advocacy spirit for education for all, really was instilled at me in a young age. So I think I had challenges all along the way, but I'm a strategist. So whenever I hear a no, I hear a not yet. I just don't have the answer yet. I may not have the right strategy, approach, network, but I like to strategize to get things done, to get over the hurdles and not get like smacked in the face by the hurdles. So I think, so those are some of my earlier challenges, but really those challenges get reflected on as I go along the pipeline. But the things that really help me is think strategy, ask people for help. Who do I have in my network that I can turn to and say, I have this issue, it's not going very well, or I'm doing this math research, am I thinking about this in the right way? But using my resources around me, because it doesn't have to be a person of one. It can really be a mathematical community or an entire community that can really be helpful and beneficial. And then I also enjoy giving back as well and helping others.
Right. Well, we're certainly grateful of the competitiveness that you have and the fact that you're willing to hand back and reach back and help communities. So with that, we definitely are out of time, but we want to thank Dr. Washington again for a fascinating discussion and also a fascinating presentation. So again, thank you, Dr. Washington.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.